The gymnasium fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the echo of bodies hitting the mat. 23 elite Navy SEALs lay sprawled across the training floor, their pride as bruised as their bodies. Standing in the center of it all was a woman barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her long black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, not even breathing hard. She looked down at the commanding officer who had just picked himself up from the mat, his nose bleeding, his confidence shattered. "I told you I'm a master fighter," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the stunned silence. "Maybe next time you'll listen when someone tries to warn you." What happened in that Navy training facility that day would become legend. How a civilian martial arts instructor named Sarah Chun turned a routine demonstration into the most humbling experience these elite warriors had ever faced. But to understand how 23 of America's finest special forces operators ended up on their backs in less than 10 minutes, you have to go back to where it all began. Back to a young girl who refused to be a victim. Back to ancient secrets hidden in a small mountain village in China. Back to the moment when tradition met modern warfare, and tradition won. This is the true story of the day the SEALs learned that the deadliest weapons aren't always the ones you can see coming. Sarah Chun was 7 years old when she first learned that the world could be cruel to those who couldn't defend themselves. The school playground in San Francisco's Chinatown was where it happened, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and the distant hum of traffic on Grand Avenue. She was sitting alone under the big oak tree, reading a book about ancient Chinese legends, when 3 older boys approached her. "Hey, weird girl," the tallest one said, his voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that children can master so easily. "Still reading those stupid fairy tale books?" Sarah looked up from her book, her dark eyes wide but unafraid. She had always been different from the other children. While they played games and gossiped about television shows, she preferred the quiet company of stories about warriors and heroes from long ago. Her grandmother had told her that their family descended from a line of martial artists who had protected their village in the mountains of Guangdong province for generations. "They're not fairy tales," Sarah said softly, closing the book but keeping her finger on the page. "They're stories about real people who learned to protect others." The boys laughed, a harsh sound that made other children on the playground turn to look. The leader, a boy named Marcus who was 2 grades ahead and nearly twice Sarah's size, reached down and snatched the book from her hands. "Protect others?" he sneered, flipping through the pages carelessly. "Like you could protect anyone. You're just a weird little girl who thinks she's special because her family is from China." Sarah stood up slowly, her small hands clenched at her sides. She was tiny even for her age, barely reaching Marcus's shoulder, but something in her posture made the other children stop what they were doing and watch. There was a stillness about her that seemed older than her years, a quiet intensity that her grandmother would have recognized immediately. "Give me back my book, please," Sarah said, her voice still soft but carrying a note of authority that surprised even her. Marcus laughed again and held the book high above his head, well out of Sarah's reach. "Come and get it, little warrior princess." What happened next would be talked about in that school for years to come. Sarah didn't jump for the book or cry for help like the boys expected. Instead, she took a small step forward and did something that seemed impossible. Moving faster than any of the watching children could follow, she grabbed Marcus's wrist with both hands and twisted in a way that made him yelp in surprise and dropped the book immediately. Before Marcus could react, Sarah had moved behind him and swept his legs in a motion so smooth and precise that he found himself sitting on the ground, looking up at her in complete confusion. His 2 friends backed away, their mouths hanging open in shock. "I asked you nicely," Sarah said, picking up her book and dusting it off carefully. "My grandmother says we should always ask nicely first." Marcus scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "You got lucky," he snarled, rushing toward her with his fists raised. What the children witnessed next seemed to defy the laws of physics. Sarah simply wasn't there when Marcus's punch arrived. She had moved to the side with a fluid motion that looked more like dancing than fighting, and somehow Marcus found himself tumbling forward and hitting the ground again, harder this time. "How did you do that?" whispered a girl named Emma who had been watching from the swings. Sarah looked around at the circle of children who had gathered to watch, their faces filled with wonder and confusion. She realized that she had done something extraordinary, something that her grandmother had been teaching her without her even knowing it. During all those afternoons in her grandmother's small apartment, practicing what she thought were just stretching exercises and breathing techniques, she had actually been learning the foundations of an ancient martial art that had been passed down through her family for hundreds of years. "My grandmother taught me," Sarah said simply, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew there was much more to it than that. That evening, Sarah sat in her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of jasmine tea filling the air between them. Nai, as Sarah called her grandmother, was a small woman with silver hair and hands that seemed too delicate for the incredible strength Sarah had seen her demonstrate when she thought no one was watching. "Tell me about what happened at school today, little one," Nai said in Mandarin, pouring tea into 2 small ceramic cups. Sarah told her grandmother everything, from the boys taking her book to the strange way she had been able to move without thinking about it. As she spoke, she watched her grandmother's face carefully, looking for signs of surprise or concern, but Nai just nodded thoughtfully and sipped her tea. "You used the tiger's whisper technique," Nai said finally, switching to English with her slight accent, "and the flowing water defense. Your body remembered what your mind had not yet learned to understand." "But how?" Sarah asked, leaning forward eagerly. "I never learned how to fight. You showed me breathing exercises and stretching." Nai smiled, an expression that held centuries of wisdom and secrets. "Child, what you think of as stretching and breathing are the foundation of Baihu Quan, the White Tiger Fist. It is the martial art of our family, passed down from mother to daughter for 20 generations. Your body carries the memory of all who came before you." Sarah's eyes widened as her grandmother continued. "Your great-great-grandmother was the guardian of our village. When bandits came to steal grain during the hard times, she fought them off single-handedly. Your great-grandmother protected a group of children during the war, using nothing but her bare hands against soldiers with guns. This is your heritage, Sarah. This is who you are. But why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked. "Because knowledge must come when the spirit is ready to receive it," Nai replied. "Today, when you chose to defend yourself with honor rather than anger, your spirit showed that it was ready. Tonight, your real training begins." From that evening forward, Sarah's life changed completely. Every day after school, she would go to her grandmother's apartment and learn the true secrets of Baihu Quan. She learned that what she had always thought were simple exercises were actually complex training routines designed to build not just physical strength and flexibility, but mental discipline and spiritual awareness. Nai taught her that Baihu Quan was different from other martial arts because it focused on using an opponent's strength and aggression against them. Instead of meeting force with force, a practitioner of the White Tiger Fist would redirect energy, turning an attacker's power into their own weakness. It was an art that favored intelligence and timing over size and brute strength, which made it perfect for someone like Sarah. The tiger does not roar to announce its presence, Nai would say during their training sessions. The tiger moves in silence, strikes with precision, and disappears before the prey understands what has happened. Sarah learned to move like water, flowing around obstacles instead of trying to break through them. She learned to breathe in ways that centered her mind and gave her body access to strength she never knew she possessed. Most importantly, she learned that true martial arts was not about fighting, but about protecting those who could not protect themselves. As the months passed, Sarah's confidence grew, but so did her understanding of responsibility. Her grandmother made it clear that the techniques she was learning were not to be used for showing off or settling playground disputes. They were tools of last resort, to be used only when there was no other choice, and when someone truly needed protection. Power without wisdom is destruction, Nai would remind her constantly. Wisdom without compassion is cruelty. A true martial artist must have both power and wisdom, and compassion, or she becomes the very thing she was trained to fight against. Word of what had happened on the playground spread quickly through the school, but the story grew and changed with each telling. Some children said Sarah had thrown a boy twice her size over her head. Others claimed she had moved so fast that she seemed to disappear and reappear behind her opponent. The truth was impressive enough, but children's imaginations made it seem like something out of a movie. Marcus and his friends left Sarah alone after that day, but she noticed other changes too. Children who had never spoken to her before began approaching her during lunch and recess. Some wanted to be her friend because they thought she was cool and mysterious. Others wanted her to teach them how to fight. A few were simply curious about the quiet girl who carried herself like someone much older and more experienced. Sarah handled the attention with the same quiet dignity that she approached everything else. She made a few close friends, but she was careful not to let the incident define her. She continued to read her books under the oak tree, continued to excel in her studies, and continued to spend her afternoons learning the ancient art that was her birthright. One afternoon, about 6 months after the playground incident, Sarah was walking home from school when she heard crying coming from the alley behind the grocery store. She paused, listening carefully, and recognized the voice of Tommy Lynn, a boy from her class who was often picked on by older kids because he stuttered when he was nervous. Sarah quickly walked to the mouth of the alley and saw Tommy backed against a brick wall by 3 teenagers she didn't recognize. They were clearly not from a neighborhood, and they were much older and bigger than any elementary school student. One of them was holding Tommy's backpack while the others rifled through it, clearly looking for money or anything else of value. "Please," Tommy was saying, tears streaming down his face. "That's my lunch money. My mom will be mad if I lose it." "Your mom will be mad?" one of the teenagers mocked. "Well, we wouldn't want to make Mommy mad, would we?" Sarah felt something cold and focused settle over her mind, the same feeling she had experienced on the playground, but stronger and clearer. Her grandmother's words echoed in her thoughts. True martial arts was about protecting those who could not protect themselves. Without making a sound, Sarah walked into the alley. She was even smaller now compared to these teenagers than she had been compared to Marcus, but her presence seemed to fill the space between the brick walls. The 3 bullies turned to look at her, and something in her posture and the way she carried herself made them pause. "Walk away," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the same authority it had held on the playground, but stronger now and backed by months of training and discipline. The teenagers looked at each other and laughed, but it was not the confident laughter of people who were truly amused. There was something uncertain about it, as if they sensed something dangerous in this small girl who had appeared so silently and who stood facing them without any sign of fear. "You hear that, guys?" the tallest teenager said. "Try to recapture the momentum. Little girl thinks she's tough." "I'm giving you a chance to leave without anyone getting hurt," Sarah replied, her voice still quiet but carrying a note of finality that made Tommy stop crying and stare at her in amazement. What happened next would become another legend in the neighborhood, though this time there were fewer witnesses and the story stayed closer to the truth. The teenagers rushed Sarah all at once, confident that their size and numbers would overwhelm her quickly. Instead, they found themselves dealing with something they had never encountered before. Sarah moved like her grandmother had taught her, like water flowing around stones. The first teenager's punch met nothing but air as she slipped to the side and struck a pressure point on his wrist that made his entire arm go numb. The second found himself flying through the air and landing hard on the concrete before he understood how he had gotten there. The third managed to grab her shoulder, but Sarah used his grip as an anchor point to spin and deliver a precise kick to his solar plexus that left him gasping for breath on the ground. The entire confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, 3 teenagers who had been confident bullies were sitting on the alley floor, looking up at a 7-year-old girl who hadn't even broken a sweat. "Take your friends and go," Sarah said, helping Tommy gather his scattered belongings. "If I hear about you bothering anyone in this neighborhood again, Next time won't be so gentle." The teenagers scrambled to their feet and ran without looking back, and Sarah knew instinctively that they would never trouble anyone in Chinatown again. She had not seriously injured any of them, but she had shown them something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. There were forces in the world that they did not understand and could not control through simple aggression and intimidation. Tommy looked at Sarah with the kind of awe usually reserved for superheroes in comic books. "How did you do that?" he whispered. "My grandmother taught me," Sarah said, the same answer she had given on the playground, but now she understood much better what it really meant. That evening, as Sarah practiced her forms in her grandmother's small living room, she felt the weight of her heritage settling on her shoulders like a comfortable cloak. She was beginning to understand that she was part of something much larger than herself, a tradition that stretched back through centuries of strong women who had used their skills to protect their communities and preserve justice in an often unjust world. "You did well today," Nai said from her chair by the window, where she had been watching Sarah practice. "But remember, child, every time you use these skills, you plant seeds. Some will grow into respect and safety for those who need protection. Others may grow into challenges you are not yet prepared to face." Sarah paused in her practice and looked at her grandmother with questioning eyes. "The path of a warrior is not an easy one," Nai continued. "As your skills grow, so will the tests that come to you. People will want to prove themselves against you. Others will seek to use your abilities for their own purposes. You must stay true to the principles I am teaching you, no matter how difficult the choices become." As Sarah resumed her practice, moving through the flowing forms that were becoming as natural as breathing, she had no way of knowing how prophetic her grandmother's words would prove to be. The path that had begun with a simple act of self-defense on a school playground would eventually lead her into conflicts and challenges that would test every aspect of her training and character. But for now, she was simply a young girl learning to carry on her family's legacy, one precise movement at a time, building the foundation that would one day make her one of the most formidable martial artists in the world. By the time Sarah turned 15, her reputation had spread far beyond the boundaries of Chinatown. What had started as whispered stories about playground incidents had evolved into something much more significant. Word traveled through the underground networks of martial arts schools, dojos, and fighting gyms throughout the Bay Area about a teenager who had never been defeated in any confrontation, despite never actively seeking fights. The transformation in Sarah over those 8 years had been remarkable. She had grown to her full height of 5 feet 4 inches, but her small stature was deceptive. Years of dedicated training under her grandmother's guidance had given her a compact, powerful frame with the kind of functional strength that came from movements perfected through thousands of repetitions. Her reflexes had become so sharp that she could catch falling objects without looking, and her balance was so perfect that she could stand motionless on one foot for hours while meditating. More importantly, her understanding of Baihu Quan had deepened beyond simple physical techniques. Nai had taught her to read people's intentions through their posture and breathing, to sense aggression before it became action, and to project an aura of calm confidence that often prevented conflicts from beginning at all. Sarah had learned that the highest level of martial arts was not about winning fights, but about avoiding them entirely while still protecting those who needed protection. The tests of her abilities had come regularly over the years, each one more challenging than the last. There was the incident when she was 12 and had stopped 3 gang members from robbing an elderly Chinese woman outside a bank. The men had knives, but Sarah had moved through them like they were standing still, disarming them and leaving them unconscious on the sidewalk without ever drawing blood herself. There was the time when she was 13 and had walked into a situation where a grown man was threatening his ex-girlfriend in a restaurant. Sarah had simply placed herself between them and spoken in a voice that carried such authority that the man had backed down immediately and left without another word. Each incident had been witnessed by different people, and the stories had spread and grown in the telling. Sarah Chun was becoming a legend in her own time, but She carried that reputation with the same quiet dignity that her grandmother had taught her to bring to everything else in her life. It was on a foggy Tuesday morning in October when Sarah first encountered someone who would change the trajectory of her life forever. She was walking to school through Portsmouth Square, the small park in the heart of Chinatown where elderly men gathered to play xiangqi and elderly women practiced tai chi in the early morning hours. The park was usually peaceful at that time of day, but as Sarah approached the corner near the playground, she heard shouting that cut through the morning quiet like a knife. 3 men in their 20s were surrounding an old man who was practicing his morning exercises alone near the chess tables. Sarah recognized him as Mr. Wong, a gentle soul who had immigrated from Taiwan and who came to the park every morning at 6 o'clock to practice the same Tai Chi routine he had been doing for 50 years. "Come on, old man," one of the troublemakers was saying, his voice loud and aggressive. "Show us some of that kung fu movie stuff. We want to see you do some of those fancy moves." "Please," Mr. Wong said in heavily accented English, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm just exercising. I do not want any trouble." "Trouble?" Another man laughed. "We're not trouble. We just want to see some real Chinese fighting. You people are always talking about how you invented martial arts. Let's see what you've got." Sarah felt the familiar cold focus settle over her mind, but this time it was accompanied by something else: anger. Not the hot, destructive anger that led people to make poor decisions, but the cold, controlled anger that her grandmother had taught her channel into precise action. These men were not just threatening an innocent person. They were mocking her culture and her heritage, treating the sacred art of Tai Chi as if it were entertainment for their amusement. Without making a sound, Sarah walked across the park toward the confrontation. As she approached, she could see that Mr. Wong was becoming more frightened with each passing moment. The 3 men were getting closer to him, and one of them had started making exaggerated martial arts gestures, throwing mock punches and kicks while his friends laughed. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, stepping into the circle around Mr. Wong. The 3 men turned to look at her, and their expressions changed from amusement to confusion. They saw a teenage girl in a simple school uniform, carrying a backpack and looking for all the world like someone who had simply taken a wrong turn on her way to class. "Beat it, kid," the leader of the group said dismissively. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does concern me," Sarah replied, her voice still quiet but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "Mr. Wong is a respected elder in this community, and you're disturbing his morning practice. I'm asking you politely to leave him alone." The men looked at each other and burst out laughing. "You're asking us politely?" the leader said. "That's cute. What are you going to do if we don't want to leave?" "Call your mommy." Sarah took a small step forward, and something in the way she moved made the laughter die in their throats. There was a quality to her movement that suggested coiled power, like watching a cat prepare to spring. Her posture was relaxed but perfectly balanced, and her hands hung at her sides in a way that looked casual, but which any trained martial artist would have recognized as the opening position for several devastating techniques. "I'll ask you one more time," Sarah said, and now her voice carried the full authority that 8 years of training had given her. "Please leave this man alone and go about your business." The leader of the group was clearly trying to decide whether this teenage girl posed any real threat. Part of him recognized that something was different about her, but his ego and his need to maintain face in front of his friends overrode his instincts. "You know what, little girl," he said, taking a step toward her. "I think you need to learn some manners. Maybe if you ask really nicely, we'll go easy on you." What happened next was witnessed by everyone in the park, from the elderly Chinese men playing chess to the joggers who had stopped to stretch near the exercise equipment. It would be talked about in Chinatown for months afterward, and the story would eventually reach ears that would prove very significant in Sarah's future. The leader of the troublemakers rushed at Sarah with his hands raised, clearly intending to grab her and physically intimidate her into backing down. Instead, he found himself flying through the air and landing hard on the concrete path 8 feet away. Sarah had moved so smoothly and efficiently that most of the witnesses weren't entirely sure what they had seen. One moment the man was charging toward her, and the next moment he was on the ground, groaning and trying to figure out what had happened. His two friends stared at their leader in shock for a moment, then rushed at Sarah together, thinking that numbers would give them an advantage. They discovered very quickly that they were wrong. Sarah moved between them like she was dancing, redirecting their momentum and using their own force against them. Within seconds, both men were on the ground next to their friend, looking up at a teenage girl who hadn't even seemed to exert herself. "I asked you nicely," Sarah said, not even breathing hard. "Now I'm telling you, leave this park and don't come back. If I hear about you bothering anyone else in this neighborhood, our next conversation will not be as pleasant as this one." The three men scrambled to their feet and ran without looking back, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Sarah watched them go, then turned to check on Mr. Wong, who was staring at her with the kind of awe usually reserved for witnessing miracles. "Are you all right, Mr. Wong?" Sarah asked in Mandarin, her tone gentle and respectful. "I'm fine, child," the old man replied, but his voice was filled with wonder. "But what you just did, that was extraordinary. I have practiced martial arts for 60 years, and I have never seen anyone move the way you just moved." Sarah bowed respectfully to the elderly man. "My grandmother taught me," she said, the same answer she had been giving for years, but now it carried a depth of meaning that hadn't been there when she was 7. "Your grandmother must be a remarkable woman," Mr. Wong said. "Would you tell me her name? I would like to pay my respects to someone who has trained such a skilled student." "Her name is Chun Mei Lin," Sarah said, "but she is very private about her past. She teaches only family members." Mr. Wong's expression changed dramatically when he heard the name. His eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been fear. "Chun Mei Lin," he repeated slowly. "The Mei Lin who is known as the White Tiger of Guangdong Province?" Sarah looked at him with surprise. In all the years her grandmother had been teaching her, Nai had never mentioned having a reputation outside their family. She had spoken of their ancestors and their traditions, but never of her own accomplishments or recognition. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "She has never told me about being known by that name." "Child," Mr. Wong said, his voice filled with reverence, "if your grandmother is the Chun Mei Lin, I think she is, then you are the student of one of the greatest martial artists of the 20th century. There are legends about her throughout China, stories that were told when I was young about a woman who could defeat 20 men without taking a step backward." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand that there was much more to her grandmother's history than she had ever been told. "What kind of legends?" she asked. "During the Japanese occupation, when the soldiers came to the villages looking for fighters to conscript or kill, there was a woman who protected the people of Guangdong Province. They say she moved like a ghost and struck like lightning, and that no enemy ever saw her coming. They called her the White Tiger because her attacks were so swift and precise that her opponents would fall unconscious before they realized they had been hit." "Mr." Wong paused and looked at Sarah with new understanding. "Now I see where your skills come from. You move the same way she was said to move, with that same impossible speed and grace. You are her granddaughter in more than just blood. You are her true heir." When Sarah returned home that afternoon, she found her grandmother sitting in her usual chair by the window, sipping tea and watching the street below. Nai looked up when Sarah entered, and something in her expression suggested that she had been expecting this conversation for a long time. "You spoke with Mr. Wong today," Nai said, not making a question. "He recognized your name," Sarah replied, sitting down across from her grandmother. "He called you the White Tiger of Guangdong Province. He said there are legends about you throughout China." Nai sipped her tea slowly, considering her words carefully. "Mr. Wong is a good man, but he talks too much," she said finally. "Some stories are better left in the past." "But if the stories are true," Sarah pressed, "then you've been training me in something much more significant than I understood. You've been preparing me to carry on a tradition that goes beyond our family." "Every tradition goes beyond any single family," Nai replied. "The question is whether the person carrying the tradition is worthy of the responsibility it brings." Over the following weeks, Nai began to reveal more about her past and about the true significance of what she had been teaching Sarah. The stories that emerged painted a picture of a young woman who had used her martial arts training to protect entire communities during one of the darkest periods in Chinese history. During the Japanese occupation of China, Nai had been part of an underground network that helped villagers escape from areas where soldiers were conscripting young men for forced labor or where civilians were being targeted for execution. She had used her skills not to seek glory or fame, but to save lives and preserve hope during a time when both were in short supply. "I never wanted to fight," Nai told Sarah one evening as they practiced together in the small living room. "But sometimes fighting is the only way to protect what matters. I learned to use my skills not because I love violence, but because I love peace enough to defend it." The training intensified after these revelations. Nai began teaching Sarah techniques that she had never shown her before, advanced applications of Bai Hu Quan that were designed for dealing with multiple opponents, armed attackers, and life-or-death situations. Sarah learned how to disable someone without permanently injuring them, how to extract information from an opponent's movements and breathing, and how to project such complete confidence and authority that most conflicts would end before they began. More importantly, Nai taught her granddaughter about the weight of responsibility that came with such skills. "Power attracts challenge," she warned Sarah repeatedly. "As your abilities become known, there will be people who want to test themselves against you. There will be others who want to use your skills for their own purposes. You must learn to navigate these challenges without losing sight of who you are and what you stand for." Sarah's reputation continued to grow throughout her sophomore and junior years of high school. The incident in Portsmouth Square had been witnessed by too many people to remain quiet, and the story had spread throughout the martial arts community of Northern California. Masters from various disciplines began to hear about the teenager who had demonstrated impossible speed and technique, and some of them began to seek her out. The first formal challenge came when Sarah was 16. A young man named David Kim, who was a black belt in Taekwondo and had won several regional competitions, approached her after school one day and asked if she would spar with him in a controlled setting. "I've heard the stories about you," he said respectfully, "but I have trouble believing them. I'm not trying to cause trouble or hurt anyone. I just want to see if the techniques you use can really work against someone with formal training." Sarah considered his request carefully. David seemed sincere and respectful, and she could see that he was genuinely curious rather than aggressive. After discussing it with her grandmother, she agreed to meet him at a local martial arts gym where they could spar safely with proper supervision and protective equipment. The sparring match lasted exactly 14 seconds. David was skilled and experienced with excellent technique and impressive athletic ability. But he was fighting according to the rules and patterns of sport martial arts, while Sarah was applying principles that had been developed for real-world survival situations. She moved in ways that his training had never prepared him to counter, and she ended the match by applying a pressure point technique that left him conscious but completely unable to move for several minutes. "I understand now," David said when he regained control of his body. "What you do isn't just a different style of martial arts. It's a completely different approach to the whole concept of fighting." Word of that sparring match spread quickly, and more challenges followed. Masters from kung fu schools, karate dojos, and mixed martial arts gyms all wanted to test their students or themselves against the young woman who seemed to fight by rules that no one else understood. Sarah accepted some of these challenges, always with proper supervision and safety measures, and she never lost a single match. But with each victory, the challenges became more serious. Sarah began to realize that she was developing a reputation that extended far beyond the Bay Area. Videos of her matches, taken on cell phones despite attempts to keep them private, began appearing on martial arts websites and social media platforms. Discussions about her techniques and abilities spread through online forums dedicated to combat sports and traditional martial arts. By her senior year of high school, Sarah Chun was widely regarded as one of the most skilled martial artists in the country, despite never having competed in any formal tournaments or seeking any official recognition. She had demonstrated her abilities only when necessary to protect others or when directly challenged in respectful circumstances. But that had been enough to establish a reputation among people who understood such things. It was during this time that Sarah began to receive inquiries from sources that surprised her. Military recruiters contacted her about joining various special forces units. Law enforcement agencies asked if she would be interested in careers in tactical response teams. Private security companies offered her positions that would have paid more money than most people earned in entire careers. Sarah turned down all of these offers, but they made her realize that her skills and reputation were attracting attention from very serious people with very serious resources. Her grandmother's warnings about power-attracting challenge were proving to be more prophetic than either of them had anticipated. The most significant contact came in the form of a letter that arrived during Sarah's final semester of high school. The letter was on official United States Navy letterhead, and it was signed by someone identifying himself as Commander James Morrison, Training Operations Officer for Naval Special Warfare Command. The letter was polite but direct. Commander Morrison explained that stories about Sarah's abilities had reached the military community and that the Navy was interested in exploring whether she might be willing to provide specialized training for their elite units. The letter made it clear that this was not a recruitment pitch, but rather an invitation for Sarah to consider sharing her knowledge with people whose job it was to protect national security interests. We understand that your training comes from traditional sources and family heritage, the letter stated. We would be honored to have you demonstrate some of your techniques for our personnel and to discuss whether there might be ways for your knowledge to benefit those who serve our country in specialized capacities. Sarah showed the letter to her grandmother, and for the first time in years, she saw genuine concern in Nai's eyes. "This is what I was afraid would happen," her grandmother said quietly. "Your skills have attracted the attention of people who see martial arts only as a tool for warfare. They do not understand that what you have learned is about much more than fighting. But couldn't I use what you've taught me to help people who are risking their lives to protect others?" Sarah asked, "Isn't that what our family tradition is supposed to be about?" Nai considered this question for a long time before answering. "Perhaps," she said finally. "But be very careful, child. The military mind thinks differently than the mind of a true martial artist. They may try to take what you know and use it in ways that go against everything I've taught you about honor and restraint." Despite her grandmother's concerns, Sarah found herself intrigued by the possibility of using her skills to help people who dedicated their lives to protecting others. After weeks of careful consideration and many long conversations with Nai about the responsibilities and risks involved, Sarah wrote back to Commander Morrison and agreed to meet with him to discuss the possibility of providing some limited training or demonstration for Navy personnel. She had no way of knowing that this decision would lead her directly into the confrontation that would become the stuff of military legend, or that within a few months she would find herself standing in a Navy training facility, looking down at 23 elite SEALs who had just learned that there were some battles that couldn't be won through conventional means. The meeting with Commander Morrison took place on a bright Saturday morning at a small cafe near Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. Sarah had chosen the location because it was public and neutral, far from the intensity of military installations, but still professional enough for a serious conversation. She arrived 15 minutes early, as her grandmother had taught her, and positioned herself at a table where she could observe everyone who entered while keeping her back to a wall. Commander Morrison was exactly what Sarah had expected from his letter: tall, fit, and carrying himself with the kind of precise confidence that came from years of military service. What she hadn't expected was the respect in his demeanor when he approached her table. He didn't carry himself like someone who was doing a favor for a teenager. Instead, his bearing suggested that he understood he was meeting someone whose abilities had earned serious consideration from very serious people. "Ms. Chun," he said, extending his hand as he sat down. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I want you to know that this conversation is entirely voluntary, and You should feel free to end it at any time if you become uncomfortable with anything I'm proposing. Sarah appreciated his directness and his acknowledgement that she held the power in this situation. Too many people who wanted something from her tried to approach the conversation as if they were doing her a favor by showing interest in her abilities. I'm curious about what you think I might be able to contribute to military training, Sarah said, getting straight to the point. My grandmother has taught me techniques that are designed for protection and self-defense, not for combat operations. Commander Morrison leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. Ms. Chun, I'm going to be completely honest with you about why we're interested in what you can do. Our intelligence community has been tracking reports about your abilities for the past 2 years. Initially, we thought the stories were exaggerated or fabricated. Nobody moves the way witnesses claim you move or demonstrates the kind of precision and efficiency that's been attributed to you. He paused and pulled out a tablet, which he turned toward Sarah so she could see the screen. On it was a compilation of security camera footage from various incidents over the years. The confrontation in Portsmouth Square, several of her controlled sparring matches, and even some footage from the alley incident when she was 7 years old. But then we started collecting objective evidence, he continued. Security cameras don't lie, and they don't exaggerate. What we're seeing in this footage is combat efficiency that exceeds anything in our current training programs. Your opponents aren't just being defeated. They're being neutralized so quickly and decisively that they don't have time to adapt or respond. Sarah watched herself on the screen, seeing her techniques from an outside perspective for the first time. She was surprised by how fluid and effortless her movements looked, even in the grainy security footage. More importantly, she could see why military analysts would be interested in studying what she was doing. Our special operations personnel are among the best trained fighters in the world, Commander Morrison continued. But what you're demonstrating represents a completely different paradigm. Your techniques seem to focus on ending confrontations instantly rather than winning extended battles. For operators who often need to neutralize threats quickly and quietly, that kind of efficiency could save lives. My grandmother taught me that the highest level of martial arts is avoiding fights entirely, Sarah replied. What you're seeing in those videos are situations where avoidance wasn't possible, where someone needed protection and there was no other choice. And that's exactly what makes your approach so valuable, Commander Morrison said. Most military combat training assumes that fights are inevitable and focuses on winning them. But our operators often find themselves in situations where the ideal outcome is to neutralize a threat so quickly that nobody else realizes a confrontation has taken place. Sarah considered this perspective carefully. She could see how her grandmother's teachings about ending conflicts swiftly and decisively might indeed be valuable for people whose job it was to protect others in dangerous situations. The question was whether those techniques could be taught outside the philosophical and spiritual context that made them effective. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked. We'd like to invite you to demonstrate some of your techniques for a small group of our most experienced operators, Commander Morrison explained. Not to recruit you or to ask you to teach our entire curriculum, but to show our people that there are approaches to combat that they may not have considered. Sometimes just seeing what's possible can inspire new ways of thinking about tactical problems. He leaned back slightly, and his expression softened. I want to be completely transparent with you, Ms. Chun. Some of the people you'd be demonstrating for might be skeptical or even dismissive. Special operations personnel are confident in their abilities for good reason, and they may not be immediately receptive to the idea that a civilian teenager could show them anything they don't already know. Sarah smiled slightly at this. Commander Morrison, I've been dealing with skeptical people who underestimate me since I was 7 years old. If your operators are professional enough to be in special forces, they'll be professional enough to recognize effective techniques when they see them, regardless of who's demonstrating them. That's what I'm hoping, he replied. But I want you to understand that this isn't just about technique. These men have been training together for years, and they have a strong sense of unit cohesion and mutual respect. Having an outsider demonstrate superior abilities might challenge their self-image in ways that could create tension. Sarah appreciated his honesty about the potential difficulties, but she had confidence in her ability to handle whatever reactions her demonstration might provoke. Years of dealing with challenges and skepticism had taught her how to project enough authority and competence to earn respect quickly, even from people who were initially dismissive. When and where would this demonstration take place? Sarah asked. 2 weeks from now, at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, near San Diego, Commander Morrison replied. We'd fly you down on Friday afternoon and have you return to San Francisco on Sunday. The actual demonstration would be on Saturday morning with a SEAL team that's currently between deployment cycles. Sarah felt a chill of anticipation run down her spine. She had heard enough about Navy SEALs to know that they represented the absolute elite of military special operations. These would be men who had survived some of the most rigorous training in the world and who had real combat experience against highly skilled opponents. Demonstrating her techniques for such an audience would be the ultimate test of whether her family's martial art could hold up against the highest levels of professional competence. I'll need to discuss this with my grandmother, Sarah said. And I'll need some assurances about the parameters of what you're asking me to do. Of course, Commander Morrison said. What kind of assurances do you need? First, I want it understood that I'm not auditioning for any kind of military service, Sarah said. This is a demonstration only, with no expectation of future involvement unless I specifically choose to pursue it. Absolutely agreed, he replied. Second, I need to know that the demonstration will be conducted with appropriate safety measures. I'm confident in my ability to control my techniques, but I want medical personnel on site, and I want clear protocols for stopping any exercise if someone might be seriously injured. Standard procedure for any training exercise, Commander Morrison confirmed. Our personnel are valuable, and we don't take unnecessary risks with their safety. Third, I want a written agreement that no recordings will be made of the demonstration without my explicit permission, and that any notes or reports about what I show will be classified at a level that prevents them from being shared outside the immediate participants. This request made Commander Morrison pause and consider for a moment. May I ask why the secrecy is important to you? Because what I'll be demonstrating represents knowledge that has been passed down through my family for generations, Sarah explained. It's not mine to commercialize or distribute widely. I'm willing to share it with people who might use it to protect others, but I'm not comfortable with the idea of it being studied, analyzed, and potentially misused by people I've never met. Commander Morrison nodded, clearly understanding the distinction she was making. I can guarantee that any documentation will be classified and restricted. These men are professionals who understand the value of operational security. When Sarah returned home that afternoon, she found her grandmother waiting for her with tea already prepared, as if Nai had known exactly when she would arrive and what kind of conversation they needed to have. Tell me about the meeting, Nai said as Sarah sat down across from her. Sarah recounted the entire conversation, including her impressions of Commander Morrison and her analysis of what the military hoped to gain from her demonstration. As she spoke, she watched her grandmother's face carefully, looking for signs of approval or concern. He seems to understand that you are not applying for a job, Nai said when Sarah had finished. And he was honest about the potential for conflict with his personnel. These are positive signs. But you still have concerns, Sarah said, reading the subtle tension in her grandmother's posture. I'm concerned about what will happen after the demonstration, Nai replied. If you show these soldiers what you can do, and if you do it as effectively as I believe you will, they will not simply watch and learn. They will want to test themselves against you. Military people think differently than civilians, child. They do not see a demonstration of technique. They see a challenge to their capabilities. Sarah had been thinking about this same issue since her conversation with Commander Morrison. What if they do want to test themselves? I've handled skeptical challengers before. Not like these, Nai said seriously. The people you have faced before were civilians with civilian motivations. They wanted to prove something to themselves or to save face in front of their friends. Military Special Forces personnel have different motivations. They're trained to see every encounter as a potential threat assessment. If they perceive you as superior to them in combat, they will need to understand exactly how superior and why. Are you saying I shouldn't do the demonstration? Sarah asked. Nai sipped her tea thoughtfully. I'm saying that you should understand what you're walking into. This will not be like your previous demonstrations, where you showed a few techniques and everyone went home impressed. If you demonstrate your true capabilities to these soldiers, they will not be satisfied until they have tested those capabilities thoroughly. Then, maybe this is the right test for me, Sarah said. You've always told me that power attracts challenge, and that I need to be prepared for increasingly serious tests of my abilities and character. Maybe it's time for me to face the kind of challenge that will show me what I'm truly capable of. Her grandmother studied her carefully, and Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out behind Nai's eyes. On one hand, she wanted to protect her granddaughter from situations that might be dangerous or might corrupt the pure intentions behind her training. On the other hand, she understood that Sarah had reached a level of skill and maturity where she needed to face serious challenges in order to continue growing. If you decide to do this demonstration, Nai said finally, you must remember everything I've taught you about honor and restraint. These soldiers will try to provoke you, not out of malice, but because they need to understand your limits. You must show them your capabilities without allowing their challenges to turn you into something other than who you are. I understand, Sarah said. Do you? Nai asked, her voice carrying a note of intensity that Sarah rarely heard. Child, you have never faced opponents who were truly skilled and truly determined to defeat you. All of your previous challenges have been against people who were either untrained or who were approaching the encounter as a learning experience. These soldiers will be trying to win. They will use every technique they know and every advantage they can find to overcome you. If you are not careful, their intensity and determination might awaken something in you that has been sleeping until now. Sarah felt another chill, but this time it had nothing to do with anticipation. What do you mean? The techniques I have taught you are designed for survival, child. They are intended to end threats quickly and decisively, without concern for the opponent's pride or comfort. I have been careful to teach you these techniques in a context of protection and service to others, but they can be used for other purposes as well. If you find yourself in a situation where you feel truly threatened or where your pride is challenged, you might discover that you are capable of things that go beyond what you thought you knew about yourself. Nai reached across the table and took Sarah's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for her small frame. Promise me that no matter what happens during this demonstration, you will not forget that your purpose is to protect and serve others, not to prove your superiority or to dominate those who challenge you. I promise, Nai, Sarah said, feeling the weight of that commitment settling over her like armor. Then go, her grandmother said, releasing her hand. Face this test with honor, and come back to tell me what you have learned about yourself. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself on a commercial flight from San Francisco to San Diego, watching the California coast pass by below her and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. In her carry-on bag was a simple black training outfit that her grandmother had given her the night before, along with a pair of soft-soled shoes that would allow her move with maximum speed and sensitivity. Wear these, Nai had said when she presented the outfit to Sarah. They belonged to your great-grandmother, and she wore them when she faced her greatest challenges. They will remind you of who you are and where you come from, no matter what happens tomorrow. As the plane began its descent into San Diego, Sarah felt a sense of calm, certainty settling over her. She had trained for this moment her entire life, even though she hadn't known what form it would take. Tomorrow, she would demonstrate the techniques and principles that her family had preserved for generations, and she would do so in front of people who represented the pinnacle of modern military training. She had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, she would be standing in a Navy gymnasium, looking down at 23 elite SEALs who had just discovered that there were aspects of combat they had never encountered before. She had no way of predicting that her demonstration would become a legend that would be told and retold throughout the military community for years to come. But as the plane touched down and she prepared to face whatever challenges awaited her, Sarah Chun carried with her the confidence that came from 8 years. The team leader I mentioned, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, has put together a group of his most experienced operators for this session. He explained as they walked through corridors lined with photographs of SEAL teams from past decades. These are men who have seen action in multiple theaters and who have trained with martial arts experts from around the world. I want you to understand that they're approaching this with open minds, but they're also very confident in their abilities. Sarah nodded, appreciating the continued honesty about what she was walking into. How much have you told them about what I'll be demonstrating? Very little, Commander Morrison replied. I explained that you practice a traditional Chinese martial art that focuses on efficiency and precision, and that you've demonstrated remarkable success in controlled applications. I didn't want to oversell what you can do or create unrealistic expectations. They stopped outside a heavy door marked Gymnasium C, authorized personnel only. Commander Morrison paused with his hand on the door handle and looked at Sarah with an expression that seemed part concern and part curiosity. MS. Chun, I need to ask you one more time if you're comfortable with this. Once we go through that door, you'll be dealing with some of the most elite warriors in the world. If you have any doubts about your ability to handle whatever develops in there, now is the time to reconsider. Sarah felt the familiar calm focus settling over her mind, the same feeling she had experienced before every significant challenge over the past 10 years. Commander Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but I'm ready. My grandmother sent me here to share what our family knows about martial arts, and that's what I intend to do. He opened the door, and they entered a large gymnasium that had been set up specifically for combat training. The floor was covered with thick mats, and the walls were lined with various pieces of training equipment. At the far end of the room, 23 men in Navy PT uniforms were going through warm-up exercises with the kind of precise coordination that spoke to years of training together. Sarah's first impression was that these were not the kind of men she had been facing in her previous demonstrations. Every one of them moved with the fluid confidence that came from real combat experience, and their physical conditioning was immediately apparent. More importantly, she could sense an intensity of focus and purpose that was different from anything she had encountered before. These were people who had dedicated their lives to becoming as effective as possible in dangerous situations. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was exactly what Sarah had expected from the description Commander Morrison had provided. Tall, lean, and carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that came from successfully leading men in life-or-death situations. When he approached to introduce himself, Sarah could see the careful evaluation in his eyes as he assessed her physical presence and bearing. Ms. Chun, he said, extending his hand with professional courtesy. Thank you for taking the time to work with us today. I understand you practice a traditional form of Chinese martial arts. That's correct, Sarah replied, noting the slight emphasis he had placed on the word traditional, as if he was already categorizing what she did as something historical rather than practically applicable. We're always interested in learning about different approaches to combat, Hayes continued. Some of my men have backgrounds in various martial arts, so they'll be particularly curious to see what you can show us. Sarah looked around the room at the assembled SEALs, all of whom had stopped their warm-up exercises and were now watching her with the kind of polite attention that suggested they were humoring a civilian who had somehow earned the attention of their commanders. She could practically read their thoughts. Here was a teenage girl who was supposedly going to teach them something about fighting. Before we begin, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the gymnasium, I want to make sure everyone understands what we're doing here. I'm not here to criticize your training or to suggest that what you've learned is inadequate. I'm here to share some techniques from my family's martial art that focus on ending conflicts quickly and efficiently. Whether those techniques are useful to you will depend on the specific situations you encounter in your work. One of the SEALs, a heavily muscled man with close-cropped hair and forearms covered in tattoos, spoke up from the back of the group. Ma'am, with respect, we've all trained in hand-to-hand combat for years. Most of us have black belts in one discipline or another, and We've all used these skills in real-world situations. What exactly do you think you can show us that we haven't seen before? Sarah appreciated the directness of the question and the respectful way it had been phrased, even though she could hear the skepticism underlying it. Petty officer, she said, letting the question hang. Thompson, Mung. Petty Officer First Class Thompson. Petty Officer Thompson, you're right that you've all trained extensively in combat techniques. But different martial arts traditions emphasize different principles and objectives. What I'll be showing you today comes from a tradition that prioritizes ending confrontations in seconds rather than minutes, using an opponent's strength and momentum against them rather than meeting force with force. Thompson nodded, but didn't look convinced. Ma'am, that sounds a lot like jiu-jitsu or aikido, which several of us have studied. It has some similarities to those arts, Sarah acknowledged, but there are significant differences in application and philosophy. The best way for me to explain those differences is to demonstrate them. Would you be willing to help me with that demonstration? The question hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah could sense the tension it created in the room. She was essentially challenging one of their own to a demonstration match, which put everyone in a difficult position. If Thompson agreed and was easily defeated, it might undermine the confidence of the entire team. If he declined, it might suggest that they weren't as confident in their abilities as they claimed to be. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped forward to defuse the situation. Ms. Chun, perhaps we could start with something less direct. Maybe you could show us some of the basic principles of your art without putting anyone in the position of having to spar with you. Sarah considered this suggestion carefully. She understood the diplomatic wisdom behind it, but she also knew that martial arts techniques couldn't be properly evaluated without seeing them applied against resistance from a skilled opponent. Demonstrations of forms and theoretical applications would be interesting, but they wouldn't give these men the information they needed to assess whether her techniques had practical value. I appreciate the concern, Commander Hayes, Sarah said, but martial arts can't be properly demonstrated without application against a resisting opponent. If Petty Officer Thompson is willing, I'd like to show you how the principles I've been describing work against someone who is skilled, strong, and determined to win. Thompson looked around at his teammates, clearly feeling the weight of representing his unit's reputation. Ma'am, I don't want to hurt you, but if you really want to demonstrate these techniques, I'm willing to help. Sarah smiled at the genuine concern in his voice. I appreciate that, Petty Officer Thompson. Let me ask you this. In your training, what's the typical duration of a hand-to-hand combat encounter? Depends on the situation, ma'am, but usually anywhere from 30 seconds to several minutes, depending on the skill level of the opponents and the techniques being used. What I'm going to show you is designed to end confrontations in under 10 seconds, Sarah said. The principle is that if you can control an opponent's balance and breathing immediately, you can render them unable to continue fighting before they have time to adapt to your tactics. She walked to the center of the mat and turned to face Thompson, who had followed her with the kind of cautious confidence that came from years of training and combat experience. Around them, the other SEALs formed a loose circle to observe the demonstration, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. Petty Officer Thompson, I want you to approach this exactly as you would approach any hand-to-hand combat situation, Sarah instructed. Use whatever techniques you think are most effective and don't hold back out of concern for my safety. I need you to provide genuine resistance so that everyone can see how these techniques work against a skilled opponent. Thompson nodded and dropped into a fighting stance that Sarah recognized as a hybrid of military combatives and mixed martial arts training. His positioning was excellent, with good balance and multiple options for attack or defense. This was clearly someone who had spent years perfecting his technique and who had experience applying it under pressure. Ready when you are, ma'am, Thompson said. Sarah's transformation was immediate and dramatic. The friendly, respectful young woman who had been speaking with the moments before seemed to disappear, replaced by something that radiated focused intensity and controlled power. Her posture shifted subtly, becoming perfectly balanced and poised for movement in any direction. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, but there was something about the way she held them that suggested they could become weapons instantly. More importantly, her presence seemed to fill the space around her. Several of the watching SEALs would later describe the feeling as being in the presence of a dangerous predator that was choosing, for the moment, to remain calm. The change was so dramatic that Thompson actually hesitated for a moment, his instincts warning him that the person he was facing was not what she appeared to be. "Whenever you're ready," Sarah said quietly, and her voice carried the same authority that had made 3 gang members back down in an alley 10 years earlier, but magnified by a decade of training and experience. Thompson moved forward with a quick jab aimed at Sarah's face, followed immediately by an attempted takedown that would have put most opponents on the ground. Instead, his punch met empty air as Sarah seemed to simply not be where she had been a moment before. Before he could process what had happened, he found himself flying through the air and landing hard on the mat, completely disoriented and gasping for breath. The entire encounter had lasted exactly 4 seconds. Thompson lay on the mat for a moment, not because he was seriously injured, but because he was trying to understand what had happened to him. He was an experienced fighter who had faced skilled opponents in training and in combat, but he had never encountered anything like what he had just experienced. Sarah had moved in a way that seemed to defy his understanding of how human bodies could function, and she had redirected his attack with such precision that his own momentum and strength had been used to defeat him. "Are you all right, Petty Officer Thompson?" Sarah asked, extending a hand to help him up. Thompson accepted her assistance and got back to his feet, his expression a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. "Yes, ma'am. I'm fine. But what exactly did you just do?" "I used your forward momentum to disrupt your balance, then applied pressure to a specific point that affected your breathing and coordination," Sarah explained. "The technique relies on timing and precision rather than strength or size." She turned to address the rest of the group, all of whom were staring at her with expressions that had changed dramatically from their initial skepticism. "This is what I mean when I talk about ending confrontations quickly. By controlling balance and breathing immediately, you can neutralize an opponent before they have time to bring their strength or training to bear." Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped forward, his professional composure intact, but his eyes reflecting a new level of interest. "Ms. Chun, that was impressive. Could you show us that technique again, perhaps with someone else?" "Of course," Sarah replied. "But I should mention that this is one of the simpler applications of these principles. There are techniques designed for multiple opponents, armed opponents, and situations where you need to subdue someone without causing permanent injury." Another SEAL, this one slightly smaller than Thompson, but with the lean build and quick movements of someone trained in wrestling and grappling, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'd like to try a different approach, if that's all right. Instead of striking, I'd like to attempt a grappling takedown." "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Petty Officer Rodriguez, ma'am. I wrestled in college, and I've trained extensively in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu." "Excellent," Sarah said. Grappling techniques provide a good opportunity to demonstrate how these principles work against opponents who are trying to control your body position. Rodriguez approached the demonstration with more caution than Thompson had shown, clearly having learned something from watching his teammates' experience. He moved forward slowly, looking for an opportunity to establish a grip that would allow him to use his grappling skills effectively. What happened next was even more dramatic than the first demonstration. Rodriguez never managed to establish any kind of grip or control. Every time he reached for Sarah, she was somehow not where his hands expected her to be. When he tried to change tactics and go for a low takedown, he found himself caught in what felt like an unbreakable hold that left him completely immobilized but uninjured. "The principle here is the same," Sarah explained while Rodriguez struggled unsuccessfully to escape from her control. "By understanding how an opponent intends to move, you can position yourself to redirect that movement before it becomes effective." She released Rodriguez, who stepped back with a look of complete bewilderment. "Ma'am, I've trained with some of the best grapplers in the world, and I've never encountered anything like that. It felt like you knew what I was going to do before I did it." In a sense, That's exactly what happened, Sarah said. Part of what I've been trained to do is read an opponent's intentions through their posture, breathing, and micro movements. By the time you commit to a specific technique, someone who knows what to look for has already seen it coming and prepared to counter. The mood in the gymnasium had shifted dramatically. Where there had been polite skepticism before, there was now intense curiosity and something approaching awe. These were men who had spent their careers studying combat, and they were seeing techniques and principles that challenged their understanding of what was possible in hand-to-hand fighting. Lieutenant Commander Hayes consulted quietly with Commander Morrison for a moment, then turned back to Sarah. Ms. Chun, would you be willing to demonstrate these techniques against multiple opponents? I'm thinking specifically about situations where our personnel might be outnumbered, but need to neutralize threats quickly and quietly. Sarah felt a slight chill of anticipation. This was the moment her grandmother had warned her about, when the demonstration would evolve beyond simple technique, sharing into something that felt more like a challenge. But she also recognized that this was why she was here, to show these men capabilities that might help them survive dangerous situations. How many opponents are you thinking about? Sarah asked. Hayes looked around at his team, mentally calculating. Let's start with 3 and see how that goes. 3 of the SEALs stepped forward, Thompson, Rodriguez, and a third man who introduced himself as Petty Officer Williams. All 3 were experienced fighters, and all 3 had now seen demonstrations of Sarah's techniques. They would be approaching this encounter with maximum caution and respect for her abilities. Same rules as before, Sarah said. Approach this as you would approach any combat situation. Use whatever techniques you think will be most effective, coordinate your attacks, and don't hold back out of concern for my safety. The 3 men spread out around her, clearly having discussed tactics while she was speaking with their commanders. Their positioning was professional and intelligent, designed to prevent her from focusing on one opponent while leaving herself vulnerable to attacks from the others. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed in military training facilities for years to come. Sarah moved through the 3 men like she was dancing, never seeming rushed or off-balance despite facing multiple skilled opponents attacking in coordination. Thompson found himself on the ground again within the first few seconds. Rodriguez managed to last slightly longer, but ended up immobilized in a hold that he couldn't break or escape. Williams, who had tried to wait for an opening while his teammates engaged, discovered that Sarah could deal with multiple opponents simultaneously without losing track of any of them. When the encounter was over, all 3 SEALs were on the ground, and Sarah was standing calmly in the center of the mat, not even breathing hard. The total elapsed time had been less than 15 seconds. The silence in the gymnasium was profound. 20 men who had dedicated their lives to becoming the most effective warriors possible had just watched a teenage girl defeat 3 of their best fighters simultaneously, using techniques that seemed to operate according to different laws of physics than anything they had ever encountered. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was the first to speak, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been awe. Ms. Chun, what we've just witnessed is unlike anything in our training curriculum. Would you be willing to show us how these techniques work against larger groups? Sarah looked around at the assembled SEALs and realized that the demonstration had reached a tipping point. What had started as a simple sharing of techniques had evolved into something that was challenging these men's understanding of their own capabilities. She could see in their faces a mixture of professional curiosity and personal uncertainty that told her they needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with. How large a group are you thinking about, Commander Hayes? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Hayes looked around at his remaining men, then back at Sarah. All of them, he said quietly. I need to understand what you're capable of, and my men need to see it for themselves. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling over her. This was no longer a demonstration or a training exercise. This had become a test of capabilities that would determine how these men thought about combat for the rest of their careers. More importantly, it had become a test of her own abilities against the highest level of opposition she had ever faced. Commander Hayes, she said, are you sure that's what you want? Because once we cross that line, this stops being a demonstration and becomes something else entirely. What do you mean? He asked. Sarah looked around at the assembled SEALs, all of whom were watching her with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for pre-mission briefings. I mean that if I demonstrate my full capabilities against your entire team, they're going to walk away from this experience with a completely different understanding of what's possible in combat. That kind of knowledge changes people. Are you prepared for the consequences of that change? Hayes considered her question seriously, clearly understanding that she was offering him a chance to step back from whatever was about to happen. After a long moment, he nodded. Ms. Chun, these men face impossible odds on a regular basis. If there are techniques or principles that might give them an advantage in those situations, they need to know about them, regardless of how that knowledge might affect their self-perception. Sarah nodded, feeling the last of her reservations fall away. Her grandmother had taught her that there came moments in every martial artist's life when they had to demonstrate the full extent of their capabilities, not for their own glory, but to fulfill their responsibility to share knowledge that might protect others. In that case, Commander Hayes, she said, her voice carrying a note of finality that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously, I suggest you have your medical personnel standing by, because I'm about to show you and your men exactly what 800 years of martial arts evolution looks like when it's applied without restraint. The transformation that came over Sarah in that moment was unlike anything the assembled SEALs had witnessed during the previous demonstrations. Where before she had been impressive and efficient, now she became something that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human capability. Her breathing shifted to a pattern that was barely perceptible. Her posture aligned itself with a precision that spoke to years of disciplined training, and her presence expanded to fill the entire gymnasium. Most importantly, her eyes changed. The friendly, respectful young woman who had been speaking with them moments before was gone, replaced by